You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. This week I'm talking about Customer Due Diligence, CDD, or Client Due Diligence, and anti-money laundering with Olly Thornton-Berry, the co-founder and managing director of Thirdfort. Thanks very much indeed for joining the podcast, Olly.
Thanks for having me, David.
There's a huge amount going on in this space. CDD and AML is the bane of most conveyancers' lives. So I'm anticipating that this is going to be an interesting discussion. My first question is always the same. I'd like you first off to tell us a little bit about yourself, please, Olly. Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. So Thirdfort combines know your client, KYC, anti-money laundering, AML, and source of funds for individual and business clients in a simple platform that just works. We launched in 2019. We're used by just over 1,000 businesses across legal and property who verified well over 1 million of their clients using Thirdfort. In terms of why we started the business, it was a issue close to our heart. A friend actually was going through a property transaction, got defrauded. That prompted us to speak to lawyers, property professionals, and we found out that the issue of fraud, money laundering was big and growing. And so we wanted to build a solution to solve that problem. And started out with a mission to protect society from fraud and money laundering, and very much remain true to that today.
This is 2019, and at that time there's a number of providers already in the marketplace, aren't there, for ID and AML? What did you set out to achieve? How was Thirdfort going to be different?
To answer that question, I think it's worth just looking at the history around KYC, AML, sort of CDD in general. Around 10 years ago, client due diligence for a lawyer, as an example, involved a pretty rudimentary background check. Does John Smith live at 23 Acacia Avenue based on an Experian address match? Is John Smith politically exposed? Are they a PEP? Are they on some sort of sanctions list? And there were suppliers out there that would allow you to just put John Smith plus address plus a date of birth, and you'd get a result in a matter of seconds. And that really was most of what was involved in client due diligence. Now, around 5 years ago, when we started looking at the space, it had evolved somewhat. And in addition to that, lawyers were tasked with proving the identity documents of their clients. And in order to do that, they had to physically check documents, match the individuals, as well as also putting the basic information into a system. And so what you saw then 5 years ago was the first time that the actual client had to do something themselves. And it wasn't just the lawyer, the agent, etc., doing it remotely on their computer. And so clients for the first time had to physically go into a branch, an office with their documents, with their passport or driver's license. And then you look at the evolution from that period 5 years ago to today. And today you've got so much more that's involved in that client due diligence, KYC and AML. Not only are ID documents needed to be verified, there's bank statements, there's questionnaires, there's evidence involved in source of funds and source of wealth. There's ancillary checking of all of that information and making a decision as to whether to actually move forward with that client. And so you can see this sort of stepping stone of manual work and headache for both the lawyer, but also their client that's having to do more and more and more. And for you and I, David, and those out there that are consumers, we typically are only involved in a property transaction a minimum every 5 years. Typically people are more like 10 to 15 years. So when so much has changed in kind of 10 years as I've described there, the expectation from clients to do almost nothing is still there, and reference to previous transactions, which means you've got frustrated clients, you've got frustrated lawyers, you've got risk and compliance people. So we could sort of start to connect the dots and see look, this is only getting harder in a more regulated world where there's more fraud, there's more money laundering, the expectations of digital are going up. So we've very much wanted to build a platform and a system that played into that trend, that put the client obviously at the heart of it, allowed them to provide the information in a seamless and digital way through a mobile app, but also allow the lawyer or the professional, no matter what the transaction was, to be able to verify that client in seconds, we say, or minutes, not weeks, which it typically takes for some clients now. So that was a sort of zoomed out trend that we could spot. And, we think we've obviously come a long way in the sort of 4 years since we launched, but there's tons more that we can build. And also this problem's only growing.
There's this perfect storm, isn't there, for conveyancers and property lawyers, where the regulatory burden seems to only be heading in one direction. There's more and more pressure on them to do this. I mean, we've had the climate change guidance come out from the Law Society in the last couple of days, and I know that's unrelated, but that's another thing that seems to fall at the desk of the conveyancer. I guess my question to you is, how can we expect conveyancers to be the police, to be the AML police, when for the most part they're simply not trained to be?
Something we hear the whole time from speaking to lawyers is we went to law school to learn how to advise our clients on the legal matter at hand. We didn't go to law school, or I didn't go into this profession to be a forensic investigator, plus lots of other things that have emerged over the past few years. So forensic investigation is something, those words we hear a lot. And how am I supposed to spot a fake identity document? How am I supposed to spot a fake bank statement? How am I supposed to know whether this client isn't being very sophisticated in how they're laundering money? That's not my job or my role. But as you say, as regulation has ramped up, as the problem of money laundering and fraud has increased, the governments and regulators have pointed at professionals to say, you need to do more, often without specifying what more is. And in the risk-based approach, there's so much ambiguity at times around what actually needs to be done to be sufficient. And I think, our job as one of the partners to lots of these firms is to help them be armed with the best tools that are out there to more accurately and confidently know who their clients is, where their clients' money comes from, and whether they're actually able to transact safely with their clients. Because ultimately, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about identifying the needle in the haystack, the person that is a bad actor, the 0.001%, which means every single other person has to go through a painful process. Every professional has to do that. So, it is tougher for sure. There's no getting away from that, and people recognize it. But equally, I'm a huge believer that we all need to do our bit to stop, this money laundering problem and this fraudulent problem. You would have seen in the press, I'm sure, recently around the guy who heads up the Wagner Group, Prigozhin. He instructed a London lawyer using a fake utility bill, and he was still able to utilize legal services. And this was within the last 3 years. He was heavily sanctioned back then. He was able to access and use legal services in the UK, which, that guy just shouldn't be able to do that. I'm a huge believer and I'm passionate about it. We shouldn't allow people like that to operate in this country. And so it is on us to do the best we can, but I think we need to do that in the most joined up way, leveraging, the best capabilities that are out there.
The regulatory burden is increasing for lawyers, and this is lawyers across the board, not just conveyancing. I think you allude to the fact that regardless of whether you're writing a will or instructing a divorce or whatever the scenario is, all lawyers have got to go through this process. You're a compliance professional, you're an ID professional. What does CDD actually mean in practice? How can we apply this risk-based approach, and how do tools like Thirdfort, which is a same process every time, how do they fit into that risk-based approach?
And the risk-based approach in CDD, it varies on a transaction by transaction basis, but at the heart of client due diligence is knowing, is your client who they say they are the documents that they're offering up legitimate, and is the money that they're using, if they're purchasing some sort of asset like a property, from a legitimate source. And then the last bit is when they come to actually transferring and sending the money, is that the same money that you've checked the origin of that's been used to purchase something like an asset? And so the core of that is all these checks that need to be run. And the professional, the lawyer, needs to be sure that when they're running these checks, the outputs of those are genuine. And so they know that identity document is real with the highest degree of certainty. They know that the information they're getting around the bank statements is true. They know that the person is sending the money, actually that money comes from the same pool of funds that's being checked, et cetera, et cetera. So within CDD, it's all of these checks that need to be run on a client. And what we aim to do is pick and choose the best suppliers out there on the market, suppliers that banks, governments, et cetera, use. And for something like a digital identity, we use a whole array of different suppliers for that, based on the different riskiness of a transaction, to allow that professional to get the most robust check and view of that client, so they can go forward and actually transact with them confidently.
What evidence are we seeing that professional indemnity is now connected in some way to a more robust CDD process? Because the insurers tell us that one of their biggest risks, particularly on conveyancing, is the cost of fraud.
The evidence and the data tells you that the cost of insurance is less if you use a platform like Thirdfort. We are, of course, not the only ones, but our platform is tied to a insurance underwriter who has really kicked the tires on the underlying technology and said, actually, I believe that as long as this professional, this lawyer, uses Thirdfort on a certain percentage of their clients, there is less likelihood of fraud happening, compared to the low bar that is lawyers, compliance people physically eyeballing paper documents or physical documents. That bar is just so low. So in the first instance, you've just got to use some form of technology to help you. But actually, if you're using the most robust technology in the marketplace, well, then somebody that is actually cold hard cash in the form of insurance premium, if that's lower by the tune of 10 to 20%, and we're just coming to the end of our second year of that's the evidence, the cost of that insurance. And we would hope to see, as platforms, not just Thirdfort, but others are built out and the risk capability goes up and up and up, we'd hope to see continued downward pressure on those insurance premiums and the cost of that insurance, because it obviously has spiraled out of control over the past 3 or 4 years.
So you're obviously going out and you're selling Thirdfort, and the other providers are selling their solutions. Are you still coming across firms using paper and physically eyeballing documentation?
All the time. It's pretty amazing. And I obviously get asked this by investors, by others, who's your main competition? And actually what I say to them is obviously lots of other, really capable providers out there. But our main competition is email, is paper, is physical appointments, is Excel, is back and forth over phone. These are the things that actually we're displacing when a firm chooses to go with a platform like Thirdfort. That's our biggest competitor.
Let's move on, because there are a couple of really big projects going on around AML, customer due diligence. There's HMLR's Safe Harbor scheme. There's the Digital Identity Trust Framework. There are projects to have one source of truth across the whole of the transaction. So currently, as a consumer, you've got 4 or 5 checkpoints, if you like, in a transaction. The bank's verifying you, your IFA is, your conveyancer is, your estate agent is. What's happening in this space that is improving the process?
To answer that, just very quickly, I think it's worth imagining tomorrow versus today, and think of yourself as a consumer. In 10 years' time, do you think that the same checks are going to be duplicated 4 times in a property transaction between agent, lawyer, lender, broker? My view is they're just not. Is there some knotty, complicated things that need to be worked out before we get there? Of course, but that's always the way with innovation. The way we look at the world is we're mindful of the different risk-based approach between different types of professionals. And within different professions, you also have varying degrees of risk-based approach, whether it's a big firm, small firm type of clients they're dealing with. So there's so much complexity within any type of transaction. But if you think about within that risk-based approach, where is their appetite for secure sharing of information and viewing of information? Well, the first thing we think is digital identity. And today, you have plenty of big estate agents that are using tools like Thirdfort. You also have plenty of conveyancers that are using Thirdfort. And when a digital identity is done to the highest possible degree of security, so meeting the land registry safe harbor standards, which I know we'll get to, you would think that there is the possibility that a lawyer that works with an agent that also uses Thirdfort might be willing to accept that identity as long as it fits within their risk-based approach, and it's done within a particular time frame. So as an example, if it's within 3 months, they're seeing the same identity report from an agent that they work with, would they accept that? Some would, not saying everyone would, but we believe in building out the capability and the flexibility to give that law firm a choice to either accept that if they know Thirdfort, use Thirdfort, or to do it again, refresh it. We can also offer that capability. But I think more importantly, the additional checks that some law firms are going to want to do for particular transactions, such as enhanced source of funds, source of wealth on that transaction, if it hasn't already been done to a high degree already earlier in the transaction, they might want to do that as a subsequent task. So again, building our platform and capability to give the lawyers the choice. So actually, the information that we got through Thirdfort, that's made a start, getting a bank statement, but actually want to use Thirdfort to now do some of these more enhanced checks, and we can do them subsequently. So I think giving the professionals a choice and within their own risk-based approach to use the platform in different ways. If that is reusing a digital identity, that's great. If that is starting again from scratch, that's fine too. But we think this sort of snowball is just starting to pick up momentum, and we're starting to see interest from property developers also asking the same question: why are we duplicating ID verification 4 times? Same with mortgage brokers. And so you've got to start somewhere. I think the government has been really helpful in actually giving the framework, as they've called it, to encourage this. Interoperability between suppliers is by its very nature tough, but we are still talking to plenty of others out there. But yeah, we have people across the Western world that are looking at the property transaction as one of the test beds for reusable and reshareable digital identity, which for us is super exciting. But we also think that it's one component of all of the KYC and AML that goes on in CDD, as we've discussed. And as we also discussed earlier, CDD, as it gets more challenging in a more regulated world and where fraud's an increasing problem, again, you'd expect the digital identity to continue to be a part of that, but not necessarily everything. There's other things, other checks that are going to need to go on. So again, we're building towards that world as well.
Surely the issue is that the liability still sits with the lawyer or the estate agent or the broker or the lender. This sharing of information is fine in theory, but the practice is that the lawyer is still going to get nobbled if the agent has done something wrong.
This is the crux of the problem, and I think it goes back to how does that firm want to use Thirdfort, and how they've decided to use Thirdfort. If a passport has been checked, the chip's been scanned cryptographically, it's met the highest possible standards out there 1 week ago, are they willing to accept the output of the report, assuming that they have confidence that there's no way that anything's changed in the transaction during that period? Then we should be able to give the firm the opportunity to choose, how that works. And when you talk about liability, I think this is where we get into what the land registry are doing. And I think it's fantastic, the safe harbor standards that they've put in place, where they are saying if you meet a particular standard of checking, i.e., as I've touched on, that chip in the passport is cryptographically scanned. It's not looking at all the text and deciding whether that document looks like it's real. It's actually looking at the chip and telling you whether that's authentic. That is the most robust check that you can do on an identity document, as well as the type of facial recognition that goes on as well. So if a transaction meets that standard, the land registry is putting their money where their mouth is and saying, we won't sue you if there is an identity fraud in this transaction. So it's the first time that liability actually starts to shift, which we applaud the land registry for doing. We think it's a really fantastic step forward for innovation. There will always be those that absolutely say anything an agent's done, I'm just going to do it again from scratch, of course. But if there are those that start to think about this new world and they're saying, actually, this ID has been verified a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we are going to accept the results of that ID report, and then we're going to do our own source of funds, source of wealth, and additional checks.
And I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what if you get it wrong?
Again, yeah, very good question. And I think it's worth thinking about the alternative and create a digital ID verification of paper-based, how much money was laundered through people that were looking at fake documents and fake driver's license. So the first point I'd make is that now robustness of the technology has just raised the bar so considerably that we are just night and day different to where we were, I think, 5 years ago or even 3 years ago as an industry. And in terms of like how we work, I mean, it's on us. Today, we've got 10 or 11 suppliers that we use. We're constantly assessing those suppliers to make sure that we're using best in breed in the marketplace. But ultimately, as I've touched on, Thirdfort is a tool to be used within a risk-based approach in CDD. We don't see if an individual walks into a office of a law firm or an agent with a duffel bag full of cash. That's something that is picked up in the context of the transaction by the fee earner, the compliance person. Thirdfort is built to be a tool that can be leveraged by these professionals to make sure they have the most robust capabilities to protect against fraud and money laundering. But can they outsource everything to Thirdfort, platform like Thirdfort? No, and I don't think, frankly, they should do.
I'd mentioned this digital identity trust framework. You've touched on it through the Land Registry Safe Harbour scheme. What is the framework? What did it set out to achieve?
The Safe Harbour set out to clarify that firms that use a digital identity verification meeting a certain standard will not be sued by the land registry if there's an identity fraud that happens and somebody's house is sold in a property hijacking, etc. So I think the land registry, what they set out to achieve was to encourage innovation or provide the conditions for innovators to go out and actually build tools to help law firms. Firms, they're not experts in digital identity technology, right? Again, they're lawyers, they're property professionals. So what the land registry said is, look, we'll spend a lot of time understanding what good looks like. We'll then put in place what the criteria for what good looks like. And if you meet good, then we won't sue you if there's an identity fraud. So I as I say, I commend them. I think it's a really good initiative.
And there is now a standard, isn't there? There is now a kite mark that I think Thirdfort have achieved. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the kite mark they have, so they say in simple terms, if the technology that you use meets 5 of their criteria, they've called, that I've touched on. And one of them, a good example is that cryptographic chip that's in there. Some of the others relate to how the facial recognition done, how the proof of ownership is, what additional documents are collated to make sure there's a proof of ownership there as well, which is a whole topic in itself. So as long as you meet these criteria and a lawyer is using you against all of these criteria, then they're meeting the safe harbor standard. And if the land registry, and if there is, as I say, God forbid, a fraud that goes on, firstly, you're getting better value insurance because the insurer is saying you're meeting the safe harbor standard. So insurance premiums aren't going to be as high, but the land registry will turn around and say, I can see these criteria met in this particular transaction. We're not going to worry about, liability for this or litigation for this because I can see there's evidence. So part of it is having the report and simply evidencing that those checks have been, and that threshold has been met during that transaction.
So we're nearly running out of time, Ollie, but I want to ask you finally to do some horizon scanning. You've already talked about what yesterday looked like, what tomorrow looks like. You've obviously been part of the strides that have been made in digital ID and open banking. What are the next steps, and how do those next steps provide even more surety for practitioners around reducing risk and ultimately protecting the transaction?
What's next? I think there's huge scope really around when we talk about money laundering. It's obviously proving that individual is genuine, but I think this growing issue of source of funds, source of wealth, actually verifying all of that alongside an identity that's real and tying all of that together. I think, look, we are hopefully one of the pioneers. There's others that are out there, but all technology providers, I think, have a long way to go in building more capability to help solve this problem, because the problem is getting worse on a almost annual basis as regulations increase. And so, how can we help firms with that evidence gathering? How can we help the firms with the reviewing of that evidence? How can we help the back and forth that goes on in constant chasing between lawyers and the consumers, and helping them with the decisioning, pulling all of that information together and saying, actually, based on all of these data points relating to this transaction, you can proceed, and here's all the reasons why. So I think there's so much we can do around the source of funds, source of wealth in the enhanced anti-money laundering. We're certainly committing a huge amount of time and money to that. But I'd say what businesses, lawyers want is really this client compliance, client risk. It stands between them and their clients just getting on and doing the job. And so they don't want to go to lots of different third parties to access tools to do this client due diligence. They don't want to have to keep doubling their compliance budget year after year on headcount. They don't want, clients being hacked off at having to do this stuff manually. And so building the platform where it brings all this stuff together and it is specialized. I do think client risk, client due diligence, it's not something that can quickly be spun up and commoditized in a world where risk, money laundering, fraud is getting worse by the day. It does take a lot of specialization. And when it's an individual or a company that needs checking, as an example, it's source of funds or source of wealth, there's so many degrees of variety and complexity that I think there's so much more that us as innovators can do, but also gets spoken about loads, is making sure that we're collaborating the whole time with industry. For us, we run something called a client advisory board. We bring in 10 firms a quarter, get their frontline feedback on how their challenges are changing and their priorities are changing, making damn sure that what we're building fits that. I think, I'm not a lawyer by background in many respects. I think that's a strength because that allows me to look at these problems fresh, maybe without the baggage of many years of how things used to be done, but I can look at things fresh. And we just think, as I say, but making sure that we are listening first and foremost to our client. We spend so much time thinking about feedback and gathering that from the front line of so much interaction with the 1,000+ businesses that use us. And so gathering all of that, triaging that, and building the right stuff. And we'll continue to just, plow investment money into this platform to make it better and better and better. But as I say, there's the challenges continue to grow all the time, but there's lots of opportunity to help firms.
So that's pretty much time, Olly. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. And know before we finish, you've got some stuff you want to share about things in the pipeline for Thirdfort. So I'll give you that opportunity in just a second. But thanks so much for joining, for sharing, and for providing some insight into that whole AML conundrum for lawyers.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be here, David, and thank you so much. And in terms of, briefly touching on what can people expect from Thirdfort in the not too distant futures, we're, as touched on today, we spent a lot of time thinking about this secure sharing of information, especially digital identity through the transaction. We have a beta version of that out there, but we're actually building our fully fledged first version of that. We spent some time on the sort of 5% of cases where there's non-app based verification needed. So we've got a suite of tools there. We're going to verify international addresses, which is good. And we've spoken a lot today about source of funds and source of wealth. As I say, it's such a big focus for us, as well as making sure those lawyers that use us always have access to the best tools. And whether it's things like CCJs, bankruptcy searches, better functionality in the platform. Again, all things that we hear from the front line, and we're building out at a rate of knots.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. A really insightful discussion. Thanks very much indeed to Olly. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.